Good morning, everyone. I hope you've all had a good evening and good COP so far. My name is Vijay Rangarajan. I'm Director General for Health and Climate, well, it was Health, Climate, Energy, Environment, and various other bits in Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, and it's a real pleasure. Thank you to GSK for inviting me to moderate today. We kind of kicked off several discussions at COP26, and one of them was on health and climate and that interface. Another big one was obviously giving a much higher profile to science, and that wasn't all a coincidence. If you remember back that far, we were in the middle of the COVID pandemic at that point, and it felt quite a message to say that understanding, communicating the science, understanding where the gaps are, was really important during the pandemic. It was particularly important as we actually ran COP26, for those who remember what Glasgow was like under COVID restrictions. And it was really fundamental because it underpinned a lot of the climate science as well. So to really understand that linkage between the science, climate, and health. So I'm really pleased that now we're continuing that conversation in a big way. And again, thank you to GSK to build our understanding of where the gaps are today, what we can do about it. And I think, as some of you may have seen yesterday, we now have a real pathway to get health as a theme, as a part of climate adaptation, and as a part of COPs really firmly on the agenda. The UAE are going to pick this up really strongly next year, and I hope that therefore something that's actually come a bit out of the shadows and been a worry for some time is now going to be quite center stage. Why is that important? Let me run very briefly through, and then I will introduce our extremely illustrious panel and pose them difficult questions, and they will give brilliant answers, and I think we'll all understand what we're all doing much better. First of all, we've all just lived through a rather major zoonotic disease. We are pushing people into areas where there are new diseases. People are catching them. We're living through areas, and we heard this from many of the heads of state and government over the last days, where people are contracting new diseases. Diseases are spreading. The vectors are spreading. Certainly the areas where mosquitoes are with warming are spreading significantly. That is giving some real impact on human health. And I think one of the phrases that I've taken in the last few days has been climate adaptation is felt by people in their health quite often, not just in the disasters we see, but in their day-to-day health. So statistics like 7 million premature deaths a year from air pollution, 68% increase in heat-related mortality between about 2004 and 2017-21, 98 million people a year suffering food insecurity than a decade ago. The IPCC has warned. We all now know, and we've seen, and many of us have experienced the extreme weather conditions, the high temperatures around the world. The mitigation side is fundamental to try to control this. But I think as we focus now, and in this COP particularly, on adaptation, on Africa in particular, and on implementing the commitments that we all made at COP26, one of those has to focus into our health systems. They are very major producers of carbon dioxide. I think one of my American colleagues yesterday was saying that the US healthcare system produces 8% of US carbon dioxide. That is a lot. The NHS produces a lot. We're trying, therefore, to decarbonize healthcare systems. We need to make those healthcare systems resilient to climate change. I'm responsible for UK work with Pakistan, and it's been really shocking to see how much of the improvements in the healthcare systems we have been working with Pakistan over decades, and we really have improved. Look at the polio stats, have literally been swept away in the recent floods. So we have to make their systems far more resilient. And so last year we raised the voice of health practitioners. They are our absolutely key ally in this, a group of people with enormous influence, enormous local influence. There's a Brazilian Portuguese word I can never translate called capilaridade, which is how you get your little tentacles deep into local communities. And this is where I think healthcare workers, both for health but also for climate, are absolutely crucial. Last year they sent a wonderful prescription letter delivered to leaders, if you remember that. A good example of just the power of healthcare and raising healthcare workers and raising their voice. Second, reassert the need for compelling research and evidence on this. We may hear in a minute where the gaps are. And that is really crucial because decision makers are all crying out for where is it that we can put the money? What's the most efficient thing? How do I build a climate resilient healthcare system? And we've got an alliance underway, Attach, which is trying to answer some of those questions. And then finally, at the governmental level, we need governments to really put this into their own plans. So we have 62 countries, I think, now as allies in 2 commitments, different countries for different parts: sustainable healthcare systems and zero carbon healthcare systems. And I hope that alliance is going to grow. Finally, I think infectious diseases, the Reach and Nature report, really crucial, showing the sheer threat that will come from infectious diseases, now increasing, and a real and present danger. This is not something in the future as much of a future climate-related set of issues. So I think quantifying that, explaining that to people, and then helping governments, healthcare systems, healthcare professionals, and all of us personally, I think, cope with that challenge is going to be truly important. So we've got some of the science. We know we have a problem. We know we are going to have a bigger problem. So this is where our wonderful panel come in to explain and give us some pointers on what we can actually do about it. So I'm really pleased. I'll ask the panel to each introduce themselves in a minute. Just going across the panel, we've got Alan Dangour, Director of Climate and Health in Welcome; Fiona Smith-Layton, Vice President Global Health Strategy and Operations in GSK; Paul Mitchell, who is the Principal Climate Change Advisor on Save the Children; and Andre Zollinger, who is the Policy Manager for Energy, Environment and Climate in the Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Alan, do you want to just introduce yourself a bit more, and then I'm going to pose you difficult questions.
Hello everyone, delighted to be here today, thank you. I'm Alan Dangour, I'm the Director of Climate and Health at the Welcome Trust. Welcome is an international charity focused on tackling the global health challenges. Welcome has committed £16 billion worth of funding over the next 10 years to tackle, to do discovery research, but also to tackle 3 major global challenges on mental health, infectious diseases, and climate and health. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Fiona Smith-Layton. Hello. Oh. Nice infection control measures. Here we go. Fiona Smith-Layton, and as you said, Vijay, I'm the head of Global Health Strategy and Operations at GSK. GSK, as you know, is a global biopharma company with a purpose of getting ahead of disease together and a portfolio of medicines and vaccines. It's also got a very strong, specific, ring-fenced global health group, which is where I am, which is looking at diseases which disproportionately affect people in lower income countries, and it's a non-profit making part of GSK.
Hi everyone, is this one working? Yeah, fantastic. So I'm Paul Mitchell, Principal Climate Change Advisor for Save the Children. We call ourselves the world's leading independent organization for children. Our overarching aims as an organization are to ensure that all children survive, learn, and are protected. Is it working? I have to eat it. Yeah. And we're sharing too. This should go well. Oh, hello, whoa. All right. Do we find somewhere in between those two extremes? Okay, good. So we see our role is to ensure that all children survive, learn, and are protected. But what we know is that we cannot achieve those aims if we don't address the impacts of climate change. And so my work revolves specifically around doing exactly that. It's integrating climate change across everything that we do as an organization, but also then attacking climate finance mechanisms and finding ways that we can pull funding out of them, and they don't like to let go of their money very easily, and then get it down into communities and to children who are suffering the worst impacts of climate change, including in their health.
Okay, great. My name is Andre Zollinger. I lead the policy section of JPAL. I lead the climate policy section of JPAL, where we fund and scale projects around climate mitigation, adaptation, energy access, and pollution reduction. I've recently come on board. Before that, I was working in the area of startup innovation and sustainability in Europe, in different incubators there. And I'm really excited to be here and talk more about the intersection of health and climate. We have a long-standing, at JPAL, many of you might know, we have for 20 years been generating evidence in the health space, but it is only fairly recently that we talk about that intersection. So I'm very excited to learn more about from all these panelists here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all really for being on the panel. So first, Alan, can you set a little bit the problem at hand? Climate affecting the spread of infectious disease. What's the scale of the problem now?
Thank you. So can I just take one step back, which is just to remind everybody of the links between climate and health more broadly. I won't drone on. I get very passionate about it because there's so much to say. But we always split it up into 3 different buckets. The first bucket is the direct impact of climate on health, and that's largely felt through heat and extreme weather events. So we know, Vijay, as you said, there's been an enormous increase in heat-related mortality, and in fact we can attribute 30% of heat-related mortality directly to climate change. And that is, there's fantastic new evidence coming out now about the scale of climate change, the impact that climate change is having on on mortality. And of course then directly through heat. And of course then the extreme weather events are also massive, and we've seen 1,500 people died in Pakistan as a result of floods. But that then leads on to the second type of the second bucket that we always talk about, which is the ecosystem, or the nature, the pathway to health through nature or ecosystems. And in that bucket we talk about food. We talk about the ability of farmers to grow food, and the ability of farmers to grow food in many parts of the world is declining very rapidly and will lead to significant concerns about food security globally. We talk about issues like mental health. The mental health of people around the world is being significantly affected by climate change because of the way the environment is changing. And then we talk about infectious diseases. And I'll come back to infectious diseases, but let me just finish off with the third bucket, which is the socially mediated impacts of climate change on health. You can imagine if your environment is entirely destroyed as it becomes hotter and there's no water and you can't grow food, you can imagine that there will be unhappiness in the community, let's imagine, but that will also lead to social disruption, it will also lead to migration, and will also lead to conflict. So those populations that will migrate, and those populations, of course, in the most vulnerable populations, are at extreme risk of poor health, and there are significant concerns there. So that's the third bucket. So we have the direct, the ecosystem mediated, and the socially mediated pathways from climate to health. So going back then to infectious diseases, what do we know? So we know that mosquitoes, for example, require a certain temperature and a certain amount of humidity to live. And we know that as the environment changes, parts of the world are getting hotter, parts of the world are getting wetter, and mosquitoes are moving into new areas. So the distribution of vectors, of things that are vectors of disease like mosquitoes, the distribution is changing enormously around the world. And the evidence, so some modeling has suggested, some projections have suggested that if we carry on the worst emissions pathway that we are currently on, there will be an extra 4 billion people on the planet who will be at risk of malaria and dengue and other diseases carried by vectors like mosquitoes by the end of the century. So we have a substantial problem. So that's an example. We have other examples of things we know much less about. So we know something about the change both in the distribution and the transmission patterns of diseases like malaria and dengue, because we understand how those are being transmitted and the vectors that transmit them. But other things we know much less about. So, for example, we know very little about fungal diseases. So there is a big concern that fungal diseases will become a major problem. As it gets hotter, fungi are changing the way their biology is changing, they're becoming more virulent, and there's a real concern that there will be future outbreaks of major fungal diseases as temperatures change. So there are some examples of things we know and some examples of things we don't know, but it's what's very clear, and this is where Wellcome can come in, but I'll talk about that later. But what's very clear is that climate change is going to change the pattern of disease around the world, the distribution, the populations that are more vulnerable, the populations that are exposed to these diseases. We could also talk about cholera as another very good example. We know that as the availability of fresh and clean water changes over time, so outbreaks of cholera are going to become much more likely in many parts of the world where the climate is changing very rapidly. So we have, with poor infrastructure, so we have these diseases. We know that the public health system, therefore, needs to think much more clearly about how it responds. And this is, you talked about resilience, so we're building resilience into the system to understand now what will happen in the future. And as we understand now what's happening now, but also projecting into the future, it requires a different mindset in health systems to recognize and to think much more carefully about the future.
Great, thank you very much. You've scared me enormously now. So it's bad now and it's going to get worse and we have to prepare now is I think the subtext I take. Fiona, can I turn to you now to start an answer on what's the role of science then in addressing the issue, the gaps, and do we need to act now?
Thank you. Thank you. Alan kind of answered all of the question, all in his intro. But clearly, we know there's a lot of human health impacts of climate change go across, as you said, the 3 buckets, lots of different diseases. The area that we are choosing to contribute in this ecosystem is around infectious diseases. We've got a lot of knowledge of how to do that. So we do a lot of research and development for new vaccines and medicines for infectious diseases that disproportionately affect people living in lower income countries. So malaria, dengue, neglected tropical diseases, TB. And we recently announced that we're spending £1 billion over the next 10 years just focused on just R&D, just for infectious diseases that disproportionately affect lower income countries. So that is our ring-fence budget, £1 billion for the next 10 years. And when we did a bit of an analysis recently on that, actually over 50% of those are ones that are going to be highly aggravated by climate change. So there's a huge link already in what we do, and we need new medicines and vaccines. We're focusing on that, and actually it almost naturally has a huge impact on most climate-sensitive diseases there. So just a couple of things that we're doing that I'm particularly excited about. So obviously there has been the new malaria vaccine that GSK developed, and another brilliant malaria vaccine from Oxford, and I think we're really celebrating the role of science in that and the impact really on the world and on children around the world. But there's other things as well, that ways that we use our science. So there's this amazing setup that we have where we do R&D in Spain, and we have an insectarium where we actually breed mosquitoes and then infect them with malaria or LF or other diseases and see how it spreads. And the scientists there realised that they weren't able to infect a certain batch of mosquitoes with malaria. And then they were looked, and they were all carrying a certain bacteria, a Delphtia bacteria, which made it impossible for them to get infected. So now we're doing a trial out on the ground and actually having a look at, are there any controls of the vectors themselves that are going to change with climate change. So there's really kind of cool science and things we're doing. And also to your spreading point, the 4 billion people who are going to be at risk, there's another project that we're doing around using artificial intelligence to start to track the migration of mosquitoes. We're doing it with Microsoft, and they've actually positioned little mini robots in the forests and hills in Nepal and are able to sample mosquitoes, and actually then we can track through that where the mosquito spread is. So, you know, in terms of adding to surveillance and how we can then also get knowledge around the world. So very excited about that. That's what we're doing, and a lot more.
Yeah, so I think that's the response to what you said. Great, thank you, Fiona. I'm going to turn to Andrea and Paul now to talk about then the role of evidence and what evidence you've gathered and what you can now see, where are the evidence gaps as well? We've heard a bit about the science gaps and what's going on, but the evidence gaps now. So I wonder, Andre first.
Okay, I will try to. Yes, good. This is a good microphone. So as Fiona just pointed out, I think it's important to start with acknowledging the fact that structural inequities are such that low-income communities are the ones that are most affected by climate change-related health hazards. And for me at least, is that we don't have that much of the knowledge of how to actually implement these incredible innovations that we're hearing about. And I think that's a little bit where we come in, and with JPAL, we try to build up that evidence base for policymakers, not to come up with a silver bullet, or you know, we don't believe in that. We think that answers are complex and they have to be localized. And so we work in bringing rigorous research using randomized evaluations in very specific settings, where we understand the context, and then we try to scale those. Particularly matter between 20 to 30% in our trials, and then this happened several years ago, so now we've been scaling up, and now we're reaching over 200 industries in the state of Gujarat, and our partnership is strengthening, and so hopefully we will have eventually a trading scheme that will cover the entire state, and then other states in India as well are in conversation. So this is how we like to work, and I think that we can start seeing impact, and I really like that reference in the beginning to capilaridade as a Brazilian, originally from Brazil myself, and this fly, it won't let me. Originally from Brazil myself, and this fly, it won't let me talk. This idea of capilaridade is very, I think, relevant to our work and trying to...
Direction of travel. We know where things are headed, even if we don't know exactly what's going to happen, exactly where and exactly when. We know enough to act, right? We don't need to wait until we have absolute certainty on institutions who are shy of moving before they can be absolutely certain that the thing they want to happen is going to happen. But we have to start taking more risks, right? We have to be more willing to try things and to fail, and to talk about it and be open about it and learn from it. I mean, you talk about kind of, you know, doing the RCTs, and they're fantastic, but all of that kind of rigorous stuff is brilliant, but we can't wait until we've got it. We actually have to really start just like running ahead and doing things. And so, you know, and I was thinking of one statistic when you were talking about earlier about kind of the heat waves specifically. We did some research with the Technical University of Brussels a couple of years ago now that we launched at the last COP, and we looked at the difference in expected impacts of a range of climate drivers on a child born in 2020 versus their grandparents, right, born in 1960. And it is staggering. And this was just based on the Paris pledges, right? So if all of those pledges were met, which we know isn't happening and isn't likely to happen, despite all of the goodwill, the action isn't following through, then just on the example of heat waves, globally disaggregated, children are expected to experience 10 times as many heat wave events in their life as their grandparents did or will in their lives. And that's the global average, right? So when you look at Middle East and North Africa region, it was almost double that in some places. In Syria, it was almost 20 times as many heat waves as their grandparents and parents had experienced in their lives. So we already know what's going to happen. We already know what we need to do about it, but there's a huge disconnect between the people who are sitting here going, it's getting bad, and then the people who are holding the purse strings and the policy decisions, and a huge disconnect, I think we'll come onto this in a little bit, between the climate community and the health community, right? We're not talking to each other sufficiently, and that, I think, is delaying action, and people are dying, right, or being putting at risk, so it's a huge challenge.
Great. Thank you very much. I think you're completely right on the communities. They feel like they're coming closer together and they have a huge amount to add. I was really heartened yesterday in a panel Alan and I were on to hear the Green Climate Fund say there's a missing middle. They need to do a lot on health. And that was the first time about this. No way that we've begun that. A lot of research is going in, but there are still gaps, as we've heard. But anyone like to come in from the audience with a comment or a question?
Thank you. David Saddington, head of the Nature campaign for COP26, coordinated national response to the health problems which you set out? Thank you.
Anybody else? I'll take a couple and then pass them back to the panel.
Hi everyone, thank you for that. I was just wondering, at COP27 this year there's such a big focus on, or more than there has been before, on adaptation.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I think become part of the culture of certain government agencies that then systematically use the evidence and implement it. So those are the success stories. That being said, it's very hard to achieve, and it takes a lot of patience, and it takes an eye for the right policy windows to come, and then having kind of being prepared to take advantage of that. So I think that's regarding the government question. In the adaptation side of things, again, I totally agree with your comment that we can't wait for all the perfect evidence to come up. We have to act now. And that being said, we already have a significant body of evidence that's not being used. So I think that what we know, we should use it as much as possible. And when we don't know things, we have to go with our best instincts based on other methodologies. And I totally agree with that. On adaptation, a lot of our work centers around technology take-up for farmers in smallholder plots around, in very low-income settings. And what we see is that, health is actually connected with agricultural productivity and access to water and things that are kind of the fundamentals. And so if we have the right policies to ensure that these farmers are more resilient to climate shocks, we can start kind of from a grassroots level to build that resilience and that adaptation. But it doesn't have to be necessarily very expensive technology. A lot of this can be, alternate wetting and drying in Bangladesh and in other parts of the world that are great, very simple ideas, but we still don't understand fully how we can scale that broadly. So using that best evidence, I think we can move towards that direction.
Great, thanks. Paul.
I have like 600 points to make, but I'll try and make a couple. So, I mean, the cynic in me says, it's great that health is getting kind of more and more on the climate and the UNFCCC agenda, but the cynic in me says if you want to slow something down, make it a formal part of the negotiations, right? So in some ways, it's kind of better to be outside and not beholden to text in brackets. But it is still really positive that there's a lot more discussion of it. In terms of the national side, I think it's, I think there are some no-brainer things that we just need to get done, right? So we need to make sure that every health facility on the planet is resilient to the impacts of climate change that we're already experiencing, let alone the ones that we know are coming. Acknowledging there are some things, again, like Pakistan, that no amount of adaptation of infrastructure hardening is going to stop that kind of event from breaking down systems. But, we know where things are changing, right? So you don't build your clinic in the place that's going to be the first thing knocked over in the event of some kind of extreme event because you're breaking that system down. You don't connect it to a grid that's going to go down in a storm. You have standalone disaggregated solar systems, right? So there's all of these things that we can do. But I think the biggest, most straightforward first thing that we could do is look at everywhere has a health information system, right? Whether it's rudimentary or incredibly sophisticated, they exist almost everywhere. Almost everywhere as well have climate information systems and early warning systems. Those two things do not talk to each other, right? So we get early warnings for cyclones, we don't get it for dengue outbreaks, right? And why not, right? So connecting those systems is I'm sure it's not easy, but in the scheme of things, it's easy and it's cheap, right? Making sure we can deploy our health workforces to the areas of greatest need in advance of those needs arising. Like, it's quite straightforward. I think that the COVID epidemic is a really interesting example, like a test case, right? It showed us what is going to happen. Maybe not exactly that, but that kind of thing, those multiple impacts in multiple places all happening at the same time. And it really showed us where the weaknesses are in the system, and in some ways gives us a roadmap for the holes we need to plug to make that system work. So then, just kind of, because I need to kind of pitch the corporate line, you know, what we're doing as an organization is working to connect into these global climate finance mechanisms, right? They're shy of doing new things, right? They want to be innovative, and I'm not naming any names, but you all know who they are. They want to be innovative, they want to do new things, but they're incredibly conservative, and they need reams and reams of data and evidence to move a scent. And while we do have great evidence, what I think we need to do is get guys like you working with these funds to give them that evidence and say, right, we accept it. If you want to build a health project in Laos or in Malawi, right, or in Senegal, as we're doing right now with some of these major climate finance mechanisms, you don't need to prove that there are impacts of climate change on the health system, because we all agree that there are. Let's get moving and start implementing the actions we know need to be taken. So, okay, soapbox off my shoulder.
Very good. Fiona, and I'd love to comment a bit on how difficult would it be to do early warning, as Paul said. You know, how difficult would it be to do an early warning system for healthcare workers? And can the science, can the technology now really help on that? And anything on the role of the private sector would be really useful.
Yeah, so I think that's... listening to the conversation, so this is my first COP that I've been to, and so many of the conversations are the same conversations that have been happening in global health about building resilient health systems that then are able to bring new innovations in, adapt to changes in any case. And I think bringing the conversation with how we put climate and climate impact diseases as a core part of that training. So there's a lot that GSK have been doing over the last 30 years around training healthcare workers, and a lot of the training is around diagnosing diseases, identifying diseases. There's a lot of technology available now, which I'm sure Save the Children are using, handheld devices, where actually frontline healthcare workers can identify and provide an early warning for outbreaks of diseases in specific locations or villages. So I think there's a big tech element. I think there's a very strong foundation and a really strong network of organisations who are supporting healthcare workers, and GSK has been a part of that for a while as well. But using what we've got with it sounds like a tweak, but I know again it's not a tweak, but bringing in really what we do with climate. And I think a great example again was COVID, where there were programs that we'd been working with Save the Children on in Nigeria, which were focused on pneumonia. And very, very quickly, within a couple of weeks, the healthcare workers that were trained would be repivoted to COVID. They were doing education around PPE. They were doing identification and so building a healthcare system which is resilient from one set of diseases is also setting you up for it to be resilient for the others. And I think that where we can continue to work in groups and use convening opportunities like this to make sure that we remain focused on that.
I've got 4 points, if that's all right. All right, now, point number one, welcome funds a huge amount of research on climate-sensitive infectious diseases. We have just spent £20 million on both projections and early warning systems, bringing together the world's best climate modelers and best infectious disease modelers to understand how climate change will change the distribution of infectious diseases globally and build early warning systems. And there are some fantastic early warning systems now that are being developed that already exist and are used in some small island states, especially for dengue, but also are being developed now through that program. And we're also going to trial. We're going to do the first ever randomized controlled trial of an early warning system, which is in Vietnam. It's in all 124 districts in the Mekong Delta. And we are going to randomly allocate those districts to either an early warning system which can tell them whether or not there's going to be dengue and when, or the standard process of coping with dengue, which uses some locally held data sets and some planning. So that will be the first ever time that we've actually trialed to see what these early warning systems do, and will really shake up the field. So we're really excited about that, and there's going to be an enormous amount of more funding for infectious disease and climate change related infectious diseases from Wellcome, because it's obviously a huge area of interest. The second point then is, this is point 1B actually, if that's all right, which is just because we see this disconnect. We clearly see the disconnect between health and climate. We are funding the World Meteorological Office and the World Health Office to work much closer together. We are, and in the region, I think it's about 8 or 10 million pounds on that to bring those two communities much closer together, to really forefront the important work of the World Meteorological Office, make the data available to health systems so that they can understand and plan the impacts of climate on their health systems. That's point 1B. So then the point about governments, which I think is critical. So how do you get governments to act? How on earth do you get governments to act? You don't know this, I worked for 6 years in DFID. It's a challenge to get governments to act. So what we have decided to do on the 1st of February, we will be putting out a major call, and that call for research, which will be asking researchers, but not just researchers, and I'll come to that, to make climate impacts visible. That's going to be the name of the call. And so the call will be asking researchers or others to identify climate impacts in a country, in a specific context, using local researchers, using local institutions, and then to make it visible. So it's not just write that paper, do the research and stick it in a paper that nobody reads. I've got hundreds of those, I promise you. That's not helpful. We want that evidence to be visible. If people on the street, if advertising campaigns, if it's in the newspapers, that's frankly how to get change. And we've seen that again and again and again in countries. You need people to talk about these issues so that governments act. Then I was part of the, this is point 3, I was part of a select committee. I was a special advisor to a select committee in UK government on climate and health. And our primary recommendation to the UK government was that climate change was such a massive issue that it could not be siloed. It was going to affect every single part of government, and that government should, there should be single point accountability at senior civil servant level and at senior government level to lead on climate change. This was under Boris Johnson's reign. Mr. Johnson agreed, and Mr. Johnson agreed to chair a committee. I think the committee met. Mr. Johnson's now left. I'm not sure the state of the committee. But the point is that there is some appetite for joined-up government, and I think climate change is a very good example of where it's absolutely necessary. But it has to be led from the very top. It's almost impossible to overstate the horrors that are coming if we don't act. It is actually almost impossible. I scared you earlier, but I didn't tell you another thing, Vijay, which is that there are these diseases, there are these viruses and other things we don't know about, which are in the permafrost. Yeah, the permafrost is melting, and we have no idea what's going to come out. And I think they're called zombie microbes or something, but my God, they are scary. Yeah. So you want horror stories? They're coming. So the scale of the impact is catastrophic, and we must act. So then my final point, point 4, which is yes, adaptation is important, and yes, we must be talking about adaptation. But frankly, if we don't mitigate, we're doomed. So the benefits to health, the benefits to economies, the benefits to all of us of rapid, massive climate change mitigation are enormous, and we must act now to mitigate.
Great. Thank you all really very, very much. That was incredibly rich. Alan, I will forgive you your 5 points because I think they were really important. The point on join up is really crucial. I mean, actually, you're right. Within at least British government, we've got a fairly clear structure. It's now reforming itself. But there's basically 3 of us at my level who are responsible for this. 1 more international, that's me. 1 more for COP. 1 more domestic, who's also here wandering around this pavilion. You can grab Lee if you want. That's it. And so it is a chance to try to actually really join up all of this. Your point on mitigation is crucial because our treasuries and our taxpayers, therefore, bear the cost of all of this, and that's the reason to invest now in a lot of this funding. And finally, I just want to stress that point on early warning. It sounds like we've got some really big opportunities on early warning if we can join up the climate and the health communities fully. And we are all noticing that beginning to, but there's such a long way to go, and there's such a lot that we can do if we actually take the great work that's underway and make it available to all of us. So I think that one of the reasons we should all join up even more after this panel and get things in place. thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to GSK for organising and hosting all of this. Brilliant. Thanks.